October 19, 1973, Washington, D.C. Richard Nixon signs an emergency authorization sending $2.2 billion in military aid to Israel. The ink is barely dry before the consequences arrive. Within 24 hours, Saudi Arabia's King Faisal announces that his country is cutting off all oil exports to the United States. Within a week, every Arab member of OPEC has joined the embargo. The most powerful economy in the world, a country that landed men on the moon 4 years earlier, the country whose industrial output dwarfs every competitor on Earth, is suddenly scrambling to find enough fuel to run its own gas stations. The lines at American filling stations stretch for 3 blocks. Fistfights break out over positions in the queue. Service stations hang signs reading "no gas" and turn away hundreds of cars a day. A country that had never seriously considered the possibility that it might run short of fuel is confronting that reality in real time. And the psychological shock is as significant as the material one. The price of crude oil quadruples in 3 months. From $3 a barrel to $12. That single price movement reshapes the global economy in ways that are still visible 50 years later, and the mechanism that made it possible, the use of a commodity as a geopolitical instrument by a cartel of producing nations, was hiding in plain sight for years before anyone in Washington took it seriously enough to prepare for it. How does the richest country in the world get caught so completely off guard by something so foreseeable? And why does the specific vulnerability that the 1973 embargo exposed, the structural dependence of modern economies on a single commodity controlled by a small number of political actors, keep reappearing in new forms in every generation? This is the story of the OPEC oil embargo. By the end, you will understand how energy dependence becomes geopolitical leverage, see the 7-step pattern that turns commodity abundance into political weapon, and recognize the warning signs that appear every time a modern economy builds critical systems on the assumption that a resource will always be available, at roughly the price it costs today. This is not just history, this is still happening, in different commodities, in different regions, right now. But to understand how this happened, you have to go back, way back. It is the summer of 1945. The war is ending and America is triumphant, and the world's energy architecture is being constructed on a set of assumptions that will hold for almost 30 years before shattering all at once. The assumption is simple and, for most of its life, entirely accurate. Oil is cheap, oil is abundant, and the countries that produce it are politically manageable. The great oil fields of Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait and Iran are being developed by consortia of Western companies. The Seven Sisters, as they come to be known, that set production levels, negotiate with host governments, and effectively control the global price of crude. The price in the early post-war decades is stable and low by any historical measure, hovering between $2 and $3 a barrel through most of the 1950s and 1960s. This is not a market price in the normal sense. It is an administered price set by companies with sufficient market power to determine it. And it is set low enough to encourage consumption and high enough to generate substantial profits. For the Western economies that are rebuilding and growing in the post-war boom, cheap oil is not a policy choice. It is the invisible foundation of everything. The American economy in the post-war decades is built around oil in a way that no previous civilization has been built around any single resource. The interstate highway system, authorized by Eisenhower in 1956, is a 41,000-mile monument to the assumption that gasoline will always be available and cheap. The suburban expansion that reshapes American geography in the 1950s and 1960s is premised entirely on the personal automobile and the commuting culture it enables. The petrochemical industry that produces fertilizers and plastics and pharmaceuticals depends on oil not just as fuel but as feedstock. American electricity generation, heating systems, and industrial processes are designed around petroleum and natural gas in ways that have no short-term substitutes. By 1973, the United States is consuming 17 million barrels of oil per day and producing only 9 million, domestically importing the rest from sources that include the Arab members of OPEC at prices that have been essentially flat for a decade. The system works beautifully as long as the assumptions that built it remain intact. But those assumptions have been eroding since the late 1960s, and anyone paying careful attention could see it. American domestic oil production peaks in 1970 and begins declining. The import dependency that results grows every year. The Nixon administration, aware of this trend, commissions a study in 1971 that concludes the United States is becoming dangerously dependent on foreign oil imports. The study is filed. The policy response is minimal. The price controls that the Nixon administration imposes on domestic oil in 1971 make the situation actively worse by discouraging domestic production and encouraging consumption, accelerating the very dependency they were designed to manage. And in the Arab world, a political transformation has been building for years that will give the producing nations the leverage that their resource endowment always theoretically provided, but that the structure of the oil market had previously denied them. Meet Frank Ich. He is the president of the American Petroleum Institute, the industry's main lobbying organization, and he has been testifying before Congress since 1969 that American oil import dependency is a strategic vulnerability that requires immediate policy attention. He is specific about the risk. He names the Middle East. He quantifies the exposure. He describes what an embargo would look like and what it would cost. He is polite, credentialed, and thoroughly ignored. The members of Congress who hear his testimony nod and return to the business of the day. But Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the Saudi Arabian oil minister who has been the primary architect of OPEC's evolving strategy since the mid-1960s, sees something different from his vantage point in Riyadh. He understands with a clarity that his American counterparts have not yet achieved, that the structural shift in the global oil balance has given the Arab-producing nations an instrument of genuine power for the first time in the modern era. He is not a radical. He does not want to destroy the Western economies. He wants to change the relationship between them and the Arab world to transform oil from a resource extracted by Western companies at Western-determined prices into a resource that its actual owners control and price according to their own interests. He has been working toward this quietly and methodically for a decade. The 1973 war between Israel and the Arab states is not a cause he sought, but it is the trigger he has been prepared for. And then there is James Akins, the State Department's energy expert who spent years in the early 1970s writing memos and giving speeches and publishing articles in which he argued that oil prices would not stay low, that Arab nationalism would eventually produce a political confrontation over the terms of oil production, and that the United States needed to begin reducing its dependency immediately. His 1972 article in Foreign Affairs, titled The Oil Crisis, This Time the Wolf is Here, is one of the most prescient pieces of policy analysis published in the decade. It is read, it is discussed, it produces no policy response of any consequence. What none of them know yet is that the wolf Akins described is already on the doorstep, dressed in the uniform of the Egyptian and Syrian armies that cross into Israeli territory on October 6, 1973. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Egypt and Syria launch a coordinated surprise attack on Israel. The early days of the war go badly for Israel. The Nixon administration, committed to Israel's security, moves to resupply Israeli forces with emergency military equipment. The airlift begins on October 14th. The Arab oil ministers meet in Kuwait City 5 days later. The meeting is short. The decision is unanimous. Oil will be withheld from any country that supports Israel in the war. The United States is the primary target. The Netherlands, which has been a key transit point for oil reaching Israel, is also embargoed, and every Arab OPEC member begins cutting production by 5% per month, with the stated intention of continuing the cuts until Israel withdraws from the occupied territories. The embargo has begun, and the world that existed on October 18th no longer exists when the sun rises on October 20th. The mechanism by which the embargo translates into economic damage is worth understanding precisely because it operates faster and with less warning than almost anyone in the policy community had anticipated. The United States does not import exclusively from Arab sources. A large share of American oil in 1973 comes from non-Arab producers, including Venezuela, Canada, and Nigeria. But oil is a fungible global commodity that trades in an interconnected market. When Arab producers cut output by several million barrels per day, the total global supply falls. Prices rise not just for Arab oil but for all oil everywhere, because buyers who can no longer get Arab oil compete for non-Arab supplies, bidding up the price across the board. The embargo is not a bilateral transaction between Arab states and the United States. It is a supply shock to the entire global market, and every economy in the world, including countries that import no Arab oil at all, experiences the price increase it generates. Within weeks of the embargo's announcement, the spot price of crude oil begins rising with a speed that nobody has modeled, because nobody thought the scenario was realistic. By December 1973, OPEC has raised the official posted price for oil from roughly $3 a barrel to more than $11. That is a 267% increase in less than 90 days. The economics of virtually every energy-intensive industry in the developed world are transformed by this single price movement. Airlines, which have been operating on the assumption of stable jet fuel costs, face immediate financial crises. Chemical companies whose production costs are built around cheap petroleum feedstocks watch their margins invert. Trucking companies, farmers, plastics manufacturers, utilities, municipalities trying to heat public buildings, households trying to heat private ones. Every sector of the American economy that touches energy, which is every sector of the American economy, is simultaneously hit with a cost increase it has no short-term ability to absorb. The gas lines are the most visible symptom but not the most economically significant one. Nixon imposes price controls on gasoline at the retail level in an attempt to prevent consumer prices from rising as fast as wholesale prices. The controls succeed in suppressing prices but fail to address supply, and the predictable result is shortages. Stations cannot afford to sell gas at the controlled price once their wholesale cost has risen, so they sell what they have early in the day and close. The lines that form beginning at dawn, sometimes stretching around the block with cars idling for 2 and 3 hours, become the defining image of the embargo period and a national humiliation for a country accustomed to understanding itself as the most resource-rich nation on earth. In California, the state government introduces a divan rationing, restricting purchases to alternate days based on license plate numbers. In Oregon, Christmas lighting is banned to conserve electricity. The 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, introduced as a fuel conservation measure in late 1973, remains federal law until 1995. Robert Davies is a 52-year-old owner of a small trucking company in Ohio who built his business over 20 years on the assumption that diesel would cost roughly the same next year as it cost this year. He has contracts with his customers priced at those assumptions. When diesel costs triple in 3 months, he is caught between contracts he cannot renegotiate immediately and fuel costs he cannot avoid. He spends the winter of 1973 to 1974 doing calculations at his kitchen table late at night, trying to find a path through the numbers that does not end with losing the company he spent 2 decades building. He does not lose it, but he comes closer than he ever tells his family, and the experience changes how he thinks about the relationship between his business and forces he cannot control. Sandra Morrison is a 35-year-old public school teacher in a suburb of Detroit whose husband works on the assembly line at Ford. The auto industry, caught with a product mix that is almost entirely large, inefficient vehicles at the moment when fuel efficiency becomes the paramount consumer concern, goes into a tailspin that lays off workers across the industry in waves through 1974 and 1975. Her husband is laid off in March 1974 for 4 months. It is the first serious financial crisis of their adult lives, and it arrives not from anything they did wrong or any decision they made badly, but from a political event 6,000 miles away that neither of them had any warning was coming. But John Love, the Colorado governor whom Nixon appoints as his energy czar in November 1973 with a mandate to develop an emergency energy policy, spends the crisis period understanding exactly what happened and why. He came to Washington believing the problem was manageable, and he leaves 6 months later understanding that the United States has built a civilization on a resource whose price and availability it does not control, and that no amount of short-term crisis management addresses that underlying structural reality. He resigns from the position in December 1973 after concluding that the policy apparatus around him is focused entirely on managing the immediate emergency and has no capacity or political will to address the structural vulnerability that made the emergency possible. He is right about this assessment. The structural vulnerability survives the crisis essentially unchanged. The embargo officially ends in March 1974 when the Arab oil ministers, satisfied that the diplomatic situation has shifted sufficiently in their favor, following the disengagement agreements between Israel and its neighbors, vote to resume oil shipments to the United States. The gas lines disappear within days. The sense of crisis lifts, but the world that emerges from the embargo is fundamentally different from the one that entered it, in ways that the relief of the embargo's end makes it easy to underestimate. The price of oil does not return to its pre-embargo level. It stays elevated. The economic disruption of 1973 to 1974 contributes directly to the stagflation of the following years, the combination of high inflation and high unemployment that the macroeconomic tools of the era are poorly designed to address because they were built for a world of cheap energy. The auto industry's crisis, triggered by the sudden consumer shift toward fuel efficiency that the American companies were catastrophically ill-positioned to meet, is only beginning in 1974. General Motors and Ford and Chrysler will spend the next decade ceding market share to Japanese manufacturers who had already engineered their products for a higher-cost fuel environment. And OPEC has demonstrated something that every commodity-dependent relationship in the world will spend the following decades processing. The power in that relationship does not belong to the consumer, it belongs to the producer. And still, nobody in Washington asked the real question. And still, nobody said out loud what the numbers had been saying for 3 years. We built our entire economy on oil we do not control, we were told this was dangerous, and we chose not to hear it. So what really happened? History books describe the 1973 oil embargo as a story about Middle Eastern politics, about the Yom Kippur War and Arab nationalism, and the particular sequence of decisions that led King Faisal to use oil as a weapon at that specific moment. That explanation is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete, because it locates the cause of the crisis in the political decisions of Arab governments rather than in the structural vulnerability that made those decisions so costly. And that framing allows every subsequent generation to treat the episode as a story about the Middle East rather than a story about the consequences of building economic systems on resources whose supply and pricing you do not control. Here is what actually happened at the structural level. The United States had spent 25 years building an economy premised on cheap, abundant energy without ever seriously asking what would happen if the energy became expensive or scarce. This was not an oversight in any simple sense, it was a rational response to the conditions that existed through most of those 25 years. Oil was cheap, it was abundant. The producing nations were, for most of this period, either politically aligned with the West or too fragmented to coordinate effectively against Western interests. The risk of disruption was real but low probability, and in the absence of a crisis that demonstrated the cost, the political will to invest in reducing dependency was always insufficient to overcome the short-term cost of doing so. The specific mechanism that the embargo exploited is what economists call resource dependency, the structural vulnerability that arises when a modern industrial economy becomes so deeply integrated around a specific input that it cannot function normally without that input at the price it has budgeted for. Oil was not just fuel for American cars in 1973, it was the feedstock for American agriculture, the raw material for American plastics and pharmaceuticals, the source of heat for American buildings and electricity for American factories. Every link in the supply chain of American production had been optimized for cheap oil in ways that made rapid substitution impossible in any time frame shorter than years or decades. The people who profited most from the embargo were not the Arab governments, whose oil revenues increased dramatically but whose economies remained fragile and dependent on a single export. The long-term winners were the oil companies that held reserves and infrastructure in non-Arab producing regions, the financial institutions that recycled the petrodollar surpluses generated by the price increase, and the Japanese and German automobile manufacturers who had built fuel-efficient products before fuel efficiency mattered and suddenly found themselves with an enormous competitive advantage in the world's most important consumer market. The American oil companies did extraordinarily well. The Exxon and Chevron and Mobil shareholders who held their positions through the embargo period watched the value of their holdings multiply as the price of the commodity their companies controlled quadrupled. Here is the pattern. First comes the resource dependency, the gradual, incremental process by which a modern economy integrates a single commodity so deeply into its production systems that removing it or repricing it becomes structurally impossible in the short term. Second comes the price stability illusion, the extended period during which the commodity remains cheap and abundant, creating the impression that the dependency is costless and therefore not a strategic concern. Third comes the social proof of success, the decades of economic growth and rising living standards built on cheap energy that validate the original decision to build a commodity-dependent system and make it politically impossible to suggest fundamental change. Fourth comes the complexity of substitution, the web of interdependencies between the commodity and every sector of the economy that makes the cost of reducing dependency appear prohibitive compared to the diffuse, low-probability risk of dependency itself. Fifth comes peak complacency, the period in the early 1970s when American import dependency is growing, the warning signs are accumulating, and the policy response is still minimal because the crisis has not yet arrived to demonstrate what the stakes actually are. Sixth comes the trigger, which in this case is a war in the Middle East that was neither planned nor predictable from an American policy standpoint, that activates a vulnerability that had been building for years. And seventh comes the blame game, the years of policy debate that focus on Arab nationalism and OPEC coordination as causes rather than engaging honestly with the structural dependency that gave those causes their leverage. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now let us talk about 2024 and 2025. Because the specific vulnerability the 1973 embargo demonstrated, the danger of building modern economic systems on commodities whose supply and pricing you do not control, is not a solved problem. It has migrated into new commodities and new dependencies, and the geopolitical architecture around those dependencies is changing in ways that the 1973 experience should make us read very carefully. The clearest parallel in the current environment is the dependency of the global clean energy transition on a specific set of critical minerals, including lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, that are concentrated in a small number of countries in ways that structurally resemble the concentration of oil production in OPEC member states in 1973. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces roughly 70% of the world's cobalt. China processes more than 80% of the world's rare earth elements and manufactures the overwhelming majority of the batteries and solar panels and electric motors that the energy transition depends on. The United States and Europe are in the process of building the next generation of their energy infrastructure on inputs that are at least as geopolitically concentrated as Arab oil was in 1973. Let us run through the checklist. Resource dependency. It is being constructed in real time. Every electric vehicle sold, every wind turbine installed, every solar array deployed increases the dependency of the developed world on these specific minerals and on the Chinese processing and manufacturing capacity that converts raw materials into finished components. The price stability illusion. It has been operating through most of the past decade, during which the costs of renewable energy have fallen dramatically and the supply of the required minerals has been sufficient to meet demand at prices that make the economics of the energy transition appear straightforward. The social proof of success, the declining cost curves of solar and wind power, the growth of the electric vehicle market, the corporate and government commitments to decarbonization have all reinforced the narrative that the transition is proceeding successfully and that the supply chain concerns raised by some analysts are manageable technical problems rather than strategic vulnerabilities. Complexity of substitution. The difficulty of building alternative supply chains for critical minerals outside of Chinese control is genuinely enormous. It requires decades of mining, development, processing infrastructure investment, and supply chain reorientation that is expensive, slow, and politically complicated in the democratic countries that would need to undertake it. The European natural gas crisis of 2021 to 2022 is in many respects a more direct, 1973 parallel than the critical minerals story, and it is worth spending a moment on it because it demonstrates how quickly a dependency that seemed manageable becomes catastrophic. Europe, and Germany in particular, had spent 2 decades building an energy system that depended on Russian natural gas for roughly 40% of its supply. The Nord Stream pipelines were the physical infrastructure of this dependency. The decision to build them was made by European governments and companies that understood perfectly well that Russia was a geopolitical actor with interests that did not necessarily align with European interests, but that calculated plausibly enough given the conditions of the time that energy interdependence would function as a stabilizing force in the relationship. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, that calculation was tested to destruction within weeks. The European energy system that had been built on cheap Russian gas faced an emergency that required emergency measures, emergency spending, emergency diversification, and an emergency reconsideration of every assumption on which it had been constructed. The price of natural gas in Europe rose more than 500% in 2022. The industrial recession in Germany, whose energy-intensive manufacturing sector was most exposed, began that year and is still running in 2024. Now, is this exactly like 1973? No, and the genuine differences matter. The global energy system is more diversified today than it was in 1973. The developed economies have strategic petroleum reserves, demand response mechanisms, and international coordination frameworks that simply did not exist in October of that year. The spread of renewable energy, whatever its supply chain vulnerabilities, does reduce dependency on any single geopolitical actor over the medium term. These are real improvements. What has not changed is the basic dynamic. Economies make structural choices about how to source the energy and materials they need based on cost and availability conditions that exist today, and those choices create dependencies that become vulnerabilities when the political conditions under which they were made change. The 1973 crisis did not create American oil dependency. It revealed it. The next crisis of this kind will not create whatever dependency it reveals. It will reveal something that is already there and already being measured and already being warned about by people who are being heard about as attentively as James Atkins was heard in 1972. What should you watch for? Watch the geographic concentration of supply for any commodity that is becoming critical infrastructure for the next generation of economic systems, because concentrated supply is the necessary precondition for weaponized dependency. Watch how the major producing countries of critical minerals are choosing to use that position, because the history of OPEC suggests that the question is not whether concentrated resource control will be used as political leverage, but when and how. And watch your own country's policy response to these concentrations, specifically whether it is investing in the costly, slow work of building alternative supply chains now before a crisis demonstrates the cost, or waiting until the crisis to discover that the alternatives are not available in the time frame that matters. I am not predicting an oil embargo equivalent. I am showing you the structural precondition. What you do with that information is up to you. So why do we keep falling for this? Not because the people making these decisions are negligent or uninformed. The American energy policymakers of the late 1960s and early 1970s were neither negligent nor uninformed. They had the Frank Ickards and the James Atkinses and the government studies telling them exactly what the risk was. They chose not to act on that information with the urgency the information warranted, and the reason they made that choice is structural rather than personal. Reducing dependency on foreign oil in 1970 meant increasing domestic production costs, accepting higher energy prices, investing in alternatives that had no proven track record, and absorbing the political consequences of policies whose benefits would arrive only after the current government had left office and whose costs would arrive immediately and be paid by identifiable constituents. The benefits of reducing dependency were diffuse, probabilistic, and long-term. The costs were concentrated, certain, and immediate. This is the standard structure of the underinvestment problem in risk management, and it operates in every era regardless of which resource and which dependency are involved. The deeper lesson here is about the relationship between structural vulnerability and political attention. Attention in democratic systems is driven primarily by crisis. Before October 1973, the structural vulnerability of American energy dependence could not command the sustained political attention required to address it because the crisis that would demonstrate its cost had not yet arrived. After October 1973, the crisis had arrived, but it was over quickly enough that the political will to make the structural changes it demanded also dissipated quickly. The 55-mile-per-hour speed limit came and went. The Carter Energy Program was partially enacted and partially dismantled. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was built, but the fundamental dependency on imported oil not only persisted but grew through the 1980s and 1990s because cheap oil returned, and with it the assumption that the conditions of the moment were the conditions of the future. Every structural reform requires a sustained period of political will that outlasts the crisis that generated it. This is very hard to achieve in democratic systems built around electoral cycles that are shorter than the timelines required for structural change. You cannot control what the next resource shock will be or when it will arrive. You cannot control whether the governments of producing countries will use their market position as political leverage or whether the companies that process critical materials will be directed to prioritize their government's geopolitical objectives. You cannot control whether the policies your government adopts are adequate to the structural vulnerability they are designed to address. What you can control is your own framework for evaluating the claims made about how secure and stable a supply chain is. When an industry or a government tells you that a critical input is reliably sourced and competitively priced, the question worth asking is not whether that is true today. It is who controls that input, what their interests are, and what changes in political conditions would alter their willingness to supply it at the current terms. The 1973 answer to those questions was available years before the crisis. It was asked too quietly and too late. History has a way of presenting that bill, and it presents it to everyone, not just the people who refuse to pay attention. Now I want to hear from you. Which critical resource dependency in today's economy do you think is most likely to produce a 1973-style crisis in the next decade? And which country do you think is managing this risk most intelligently? Drop your answer in the comments. These are genuinely open questions, and the most useful analysis comes from people watching these dynamics from inside specific industries and specific supply chains. If this changed the way you see resource dependency and geopolitical risk, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Next time, we are looking at the Mexican debt crisis of 1982. The moment when the borrowing binge of the 1970s came due all at once and an entire continent's economic development was set back by a decade. Another pattern hiding in plain sight. Another lesson they do not teach in school. Remember, history does not repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of 1973 is being composed right now in commodities most people have never heard of. See you in the next one.